Hello and welcome to episode number 462 of the Armen Show podcast. Science, people learning more, books, nonfiction, expanding our worldview. And today we have a returning guest, which is always a delight on the program. He was back on in the 300s. Now we're in the 400s. Previously, we talked about a book on information. Currently, we're going to talk about his recent book, The Giant Leap Towards the Land of Space. Welcome back to the show, Dr. Caleb Scharf.
Very nice to be back.
I'm glad to have you on. We're going towards space. This is a topic that is coming up way more right now than it was 5-10 years ago. It comes up almost daily, I would say, in terms of where we're going, what we need to be doing to progress further. And you discussed this in your material. You are an astronomer. I haven't done too much of a descriptive layer recently. Can you tell people what you do currently and how you got to there?
Sure.
Just a reminder.
Yeah, so yes, I'm a scientist. I'm what's called an astrobiologist, so I'm interested in the search for evidence of life elsewhere in the universe, but that also means understanding the nature of life on Earth, its past, its present, and its future. And I'm currently the senior scientist for astrobiology at the NASA Ames Research Center in Silicon Valley. I've been doing that for a couple of years. Prior to that, I was director of Columbia University's Astrobiology Center in New York. So I've been working in this field for quite a long time. And you mentioned my previous book when I was previously here as a guest, and that was very much concerned with the nature of sort of information, but in terms of its relationship to living things. And there are many, many layers to that story. And then this new book, The Giant Leap, is, as you intimated, to some extent, an extension of that, in that it looks at what happens when life breaks free of its planetary point of origin. And The Giant Leap is partly the story of human space exploration, also the origins of that, going quite far back into human thought and the development of mathematics and physics and so on, but then also asking the question, where is this taking us, really? And what is the underlying motivation that we may or may not be consciously aware of for our species to be doing this? So that's very sort of long-winded way of saying where I'm coming from in all of this.
It's a great thing. And on this program, we don't have the concept of long-winded. Long-winded to me is called normal or explaining, because they're in a low description and attention world. Almost anything beyond a few brief words is looked at to many as long-winded or much, but you can't get to anything substantial if it's not detailed, has layers to it. It doesn't have to be so cut and dry or staccato like a piano.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, and I very much appreciate that.
That's a good one. Your book quietly treats space travel as a biological phenomenon, not a technological one. What changed in your thinking that made you see rockets as part of evolution?
It's a great question. Yeah, so, well, there are two pieces to it. One is that I won't deny that I'm a bit of a space nerd. Even if I wasn't working for NASA, I just love the history of space exploration, certainly going back over the last 60 to 70 years. There are many, many extraordinary stories there, many to do with not human exploration, but the rest of it. The mechanics of lofting things into space, the scientific exploration, and so on. So, that's where I started out coming from with thinking about this book, wanting to have an opportunity to sort of geek out about all of this extraordinary stuff. But then the more I thought about it, the more I realized that for me, there are these open questions about that cut, in a sense, cut through the sort of parochial discussions of, well, we do space exploration because of the military industrial complex. We do space exploration because of geopolitical tensions and one-upmanship and so on. And all of that has truth to it. But I found myself asking whether there's a bigger picture here, and whether that bigger picture is to do with the nature of evolution of life on a planet, the evolution of our species, and the sort of motivations that are obscured beneath many, many layers of complexity, but they're still there. And so that comes to this point of, in a sense, the book is asking the question, is space exploration part of the evolution of life that originates on a planet? As far as we know, life has been stuck on this planet for 4 billion years and is only now finding a way to spread itself further afield. And that seems to me like a momentous thing. I mean, apart from our parochial human sort of reaction to, wow, we put people on the moon, we have people on a space station, we've been to the edge of the solar system, that's momentous in a sort of parochial way, but there has to be something special about the moment when life finds a way to develop traits, if you will, maybe through technology and through thought, to take it to other places, away from its point of planetary origin. So the book is very much looking at that broad perspective, but also filling in all these other pieces, because I think to understand that broad perspective, you have to look at the details. You have to look at, what did it really take to get us into space? What are the sort of developments that have happened along the way? And those come out in stories of specific missions, specific spacecraft, specific probes to other planets, and so on, and you piece it together from there. So I think by the end of working on the book, I came to the conclusion that yes, absolutely, this is a momentous shift. It is a part of the evolutionary history of life on Earth that is up there with, major changes in the nature of life on Earth, whether they're things like the oxygenation of the Earth's atmosphere, which unlocked a host of new things for life, or the consequences of large extinctions that actually created extraordinary opportunities for other organisms. So that's once again a long-winded answer to your question.
We appreciate that normal length answer to that question. And it makes you think, are humans going to space? And you kind of describe this, or is life using humans to go to space? So there is something to that. Is life a chemical phenomenon or a thermodynamic one?
Ooh, wow. That's a deep question. I think most of us, and my background is as a physicist, and so I'm somewhat biased here. Most of us would say that thermodynamics comes before chemistry, and that chemistry is the form of instantiation of these complex phenomena that we see in the universe that include life and other things. It's about how matter self-interacts. The rules of chemistry are ultimately the rules of quantum physics, and the deeper rules about the nature of matter and so on. And then, why do things happen in the universe? Why does anything happen in the universe? And behind a lot of that, or at least in terms of how we conceptualize those changes in the world, I think we end up thinking about thermodynamics very often. And part of the thermodynamical way of thinking about life is that in thermodynamics, we understand that things will tend to change towards new equilibria. They will change in terms of dissipating energy. If there is free energy to drive processes, that free energy will get utilized, and in that process, some of it will be dissipated into new forms. And usually that is a dissipation into higher entropy forms. And so this is the other piece of it, which is the growth of entropy throughout the history of the universe, and the growth of entropy because of phenomena that utilize energy. And life is one of those phenomena. And so there are certainly quite a lot of us, I think, in science feel that at its core, life is very much a thermodynamically driven phenomena. It is about, while organisms themselves are somewhat ordered and can perform predictable actions, the result of their existence is an overall increase in entropy in the world. And so they're very much engaged in this flow of the universe from a lower entropy state some 13.8 billion years ago to a higher entropy state. And some sort of popular parlance, that would be termed as a move from more order to more disorder. And that's not a bad way of thinking about it, but it's a somewhat incomplete description of entropy. Entropy is very much about the number of available states for matter to be in, the number of configurations of things to be in. And the more possible configurations, the more disordered the world can seem. And so life is an interesting piece of that flow because it makes itself somewhat more ordered than its surroundings. And there, we can understand just logically why that has to be. If you have something that's just completely all over the place, it's not going to show any coherent behavior. It's not going to be able to utilize energy in particularly coherent or efficient ways and so on. But a consequence of life assembling itself into something more ordered is that the rest of the universe around it will necessarily become more disordered. There will be more states into which matter can place itself. So, yes, so life, I think, is deeply connected to thermodynamics, or maybe rather the other way around. It's sort of, thermodynamics helps describe certain aspects of life. It doesn't seem to describe everything. There are still many puzzles. Why does the complexity of these chemical structures that we associate with life seem to increase over time in certain situations? That feels like there's something missing there. And I know some of my colleagues are thinking about that, and in terms of sort of missing pieces to our thermodynamic picture of the universe. And just to bring it back to space exploration, the spread of living things, of these complex molecular structures from one place in the universe to other places in the universe, is perfectly in line with this grander thermodynamic perspective of the universe, becoming, growing its entropy over time, dissipating energy in the process. There's a lot of energy dissipation when you move from the surface of a planet to space and elsewhere. And so it all fits together. But it becomes more complicated, certainly for us, because it's technology that helps us do this. There may be biological traits that organisms evolve somewhere in the universe that let them be natural spacefarers. That doesn't seem to be the case for us at the moment. We have to do it through these augmentations of technologies, other structures. And those too seem to exhibit characteristics that place them in this thermodynamic flow. So yeah, I'll stop there because that one is getting to be a very long answer.
A lot of great concepts there. I connected quite a few things. One is interesting. It seems that life has the ability to restructure matter and energy. It's an effort that it puts out there. And then what you mentioned about entropy, this concept connects with a few others. I've recently talked to a philosopher, Dr. Rebecca Goldstein, about the mattering instinct that she talked about, anti-entropy efforts that we push through in life. She brought that up in a philosophical standpoint. And then even not directly entropy, but Dr. Brennan Spiegel has a book about gravity and how it affects us through the time of our life. That's like physics connected back to entropy. And our battle against that is forever. And then once it starts to take hold, we can't manage beyond it. So even though a doctor, philosopher, astronomer, same concept is underneath of this counterforce to that which you described. It's a funny thing in a way because you have to create a constrained lower entropy region. At the same time, you're pushing out more high entropy out there. It seems like a difficult scenario to maintain. Are we countering the world? Is it
Yeah, I mean,
can
I
it
think
be
that,
functional?
I mean, I think that's a very deep question because it does speak to the fundamental nature of this thing that we're part of. These assemblages of matter that seem to, at least temporarily, go against the flow, but in the long run, the really fascinating question is, or observation is that in doing so, in creating a certain amount of order, these molecular assemblages, of which we are one, find pathways through this landscape of energy and dissipation and overall increasing entropy that could not be found without forming some more regular structure, some more coherence in the universe. And that is quite disturbing in a way because it feels like there is something else that's happening here. The universe is just this enormous experiment, right? Every crumb of matter is in constant interaction with other crumbs of matter, and so there's a quadrillion experiments happening simultaneously at any instant, right? In terms of how matter interacts with other matter, how energy is involved in those interactions, and so on. And that alone could help explain much of this. It's the old arguments about, well, maybe a piece of DNA could just spontaneously form because of sheer numbers, right? It's like the monkeys typing randomly on a typewriter and producing the works of Shakespeare. Yeah, in principle, if given enough time, that could happen. But it seems that the universe isn't old enough for these sort of, for a piece of DNA to spontaneously form just because of random interactions of molecules. So there's clearly something else happening. And I think part of what that something else is that, there are certain experiments that latch on to something that increases an efficiency or compels the next interaction of that clump of matter to go a certain way. It's not random at every step, right? There's a sort of memory happening here. And people have talked about this in a variety of different ways. One sort of mental model that's quite useful is that of a ratchet. So a ratchet is a wheel with teeth on it, and it moves, and if it moves enough in one direction, it can't move back again. And that's an interesting model because you can make that wheel move with just random jiggling. Right? You could just randomly jiggle it, and every so often it will latch one move, one notch further. And so you can actually make progress. You can turn the wheel by just randomly jiggling it. And that's, perhaps a little bit of what's happening in terms of how molecular structures, how matter sort of finds its way to modify itself and its world in a more directed way than you might anticipate. And so I think, yeah, there are elements of that are things we're still not fully capable of describing. People are working on this, philosophers, scientists, and so on, to understand how this sort of directionality emerges in the world, because it clearly must. And it's also hand in hand with things like selective forces in the Darwinian sense. Things that work better at preserving themselves into the future will stick around. Things that don't will fall by the wayside. There'll be attrition. And that is also part of this kind of ratcheting through the world. And as a result, it seems that matter, self-organizing matter, or matter that just turns into structures because of experimentation, latches on to these pathways, this complex landscape of energy and change. And the really beautiful thing about that is, one of the products of that is stuff like us.
Recently, I saw a video describing how handcuffs work, and it has the ratcheting mechanism in them that can only go one way and not go back. When I was seeing them, I thought of something related to our directional nature, and how it's like going up a certain notch, and then we're here, and then we're not likely to plateau or return back from that plateau, because now we've gotten to one of those energy minimization states, and so we're comfortable there until the next one. So is there maybe some likelihood to the next step? There's a percent, but once you get there, the likelihood of going back is much lower, and that pushes you in a direction like you're describing, which is very nice, a very interesting, wonderful way to think about it in more detail, and connects with kind of like in your material, talk about the progression we will have as people, and leads to this question: is technological civilization rare or expected? Is there a link there?
Well, that's another deep and difficult question. I think, well, thinking about it in the context of space exploration, you can ask, how often is it, or how likely is it that life on a planet gets to the point where it learns or decides that it can move beyond that planet? I mean, that's sort of that's a high bar in terms of technological evolution, I think. And so it's an interesting example to ask, how often might that happen? And of course, one level we just don't know, right? We really don't have a way of easily constraining that. But if you look at all the things that have happened in the history of life on the planet, things that have happened in the history of the emergence of technology, it always seems to be true that stuff builds on the previous iteration. Again, this ratchet idea. It tends not to go back. Yes, we can look at human civilizations and the history of human civilizations and say, well, there was a fabulous civilization in the Amazon, 10,000 years ago, and then something happened and it went away. Or there was, Mesoamerica civilizations that were extraordinarily sophisticated, and then things didn't work out. Or there were other places in the world, in what is now the Middle East, where we could look and say, well, there were these vast, sophisticated civilizations and something went wrong. And that's absolutely true, right? It gets to a point, then maybe something goes wrong and it falls back to a less sophisticated civilization for a while. Some of the technology is lost, but I don't think it all gets lost. It's like this, you fall a few rungs back down the ladder, but not all the way to the bottom. It seems to gradually accumulate. And of course, humans come along, then they discover those older civilizations and they get new ideas from that. And so it feels that it may be quite rare that life figures out how to move itself from its point of planetary origin. And certainly in the book, I argued that part of the fuel for that comes from this peculiar trait of human thought, right? It's thought that actually has taken us to space, because you had to decode things about the functioning of the universe in physics, the ideas of momentum and energy, obviously in chemistry and so on, in order to get anywhere close to being able to build technology to overcome gravity, to get you into space, to keep you alive in space. And yeah, so it may be quite unusual in the universe for this to happen. But at the same time, there seem to be, I would say, pieces of evidence that there is an accumulation of knowledge. Technology is much like biology in that sense. Biology today still exploits mechanisms that were in place billions of years ago in terms of how our cells process energy, how cells transport energy. The fundamental structure of life cells seems very, very likely to be the same now as it was billions of years ago, at least for things like bacteria and microbes. So life has not forgotten those tricks. I think technology is similar. And I think the nature of intelligence may also be similar, but it may be a bit more fraught, right? Because with intelligence comes the capacity to influence the world in ways that are much more dangerous than if you're just a bunch of bacteria sitting in a pond.
I like a few things you brought up there. One of them is the connection between long ago organelles or whatnot, and then what we have inside of us, or some of our neurotransmitters haven't changed for so long, even though we will have technology on top of it. But the base of people and animals and all kinds of organisms has remained super steady compared to a lot of the things around us. And so I don't think we give that enough credit, because until that changes, a lot of our dynamics as people, animals, plants, whatever it is, they will not change in any meaningful way, because they're locked into a certain base. You can have little adjustments on top, but it can't really be that far away. So I like that you brought that up. And the other part that I like that you brought up is thought. The value of thought and writing is very important. I don't think we give that enough credit, because through thought and writing and combining people's thoughts, we've created everything substantial ever. And I think it's a minority of individuals that really put that to use in full, and they were able to unleash that amazing power. Since muscles got organisms onto land, did abstract reasoning get life off a planet?
I think so. That's definitely part of my thesis. And again, as I was doing the research for the book and thinking about it, it became more and more clear to me that yes, what is another of the things that it's so extraordinary about space exploration is that its roots are very, very much in the capacity to have abstract thought, to create symbolic representations of knowledge, symbolic representations in mathematics of physical principles, the principles of movement and momentum and inertia and force and acceleration and energy are all absolutely critical for getting to the point where you even ask the question, can we go from here to there? And of course, decoding the structure of the universe around us. If we still thought that what we see on the sky was all painted on some crystalline sphere encircling the Earth, with the Earth at the center of everything, the concept of going there might not have really emerged in the way it did. So it also took a deciphering or decoding of the fundamental structure of the universe around us in people like Copernicus and Newton and so on, who began to understand that there are these other worlds, and these other worlds are moving through this space that surrounds us, and that we are also moving around the sun and so on. So yes, so you needed, I think, all of these pieces. It's very hard to imagine a species creating the ability to get into space and to persist in space in a sort of random experimental way. You really need that mathematical basis. You need that abstraction in order to do that. So I think, yeah, there's some interesting revelations in thinking about the trajectory, for want of a better word, from just throwing sticks in the air to eventually putting things into space. It really, really relied on a capacity for abstract thought, capacity to model the world, a capacity to see that there are certain sort of universal rules or universal properties of the world around us. And it's really, and if you look at the details of it, it's a very interesting story that takes you from certainly people like Newton, but also through other less well known scientists, many of them women, over the last 4 centuries, who sort of developed the mathematical framework to enable us to understand what it would take to construct a device to propel you into space. And another piece of that as well is it's very connected, but I want to mention it, which is, why is getting into space so difficult? And part of it is that as biological organisms, the energy density of our bodies, the energy density of microbes, of us, of everything that we do, is very, very small compared to what's needed to propel something up through the gravity well of a planet and keep it out in space. To get to the velocities necessary to orbit the planet, to get to the velocities necessary to never come back again, and to do it with enough efficiency. There's nothing in biology that can really do that. Our utilization of energy, we're almost too efficient. Evolution has left us really, really efficient at doing lots of things with very little energy. And it turns out that getting into space is a bit different. You actually need to expend a lot of energy in a very short amount of time in a very concentrated way. And I think thought and abstraction was key to realizing that and figuring out how you could actually do that.
Efficiency item you bring up right there is something people should always take account of. You can eat a few walnuts and then that'll power you to run for how long. And then same thing with a granola bar. And it is odd if you watch the individual how far you can go doing this, but it's perfectly set up to go that far length. So we are built that way. But that's not like what we need more is like a big capacitor of battery energy to be able to get up there. It's stored. And we don't have as much of that. So we have to make extended forms of ourselves to do that. Because of that, are the spacecraft we make organisms in a functional sense, and as they go out, do we become a multi-planet species through our machines?
Yes, I think. So I think this is one of the other fascinating aspects of thinking about the nature of space exploration away from the sort of parochial side of things, the sort of political and geopolitical side, but the big picture. We clearly, as humans, as life evolved on the surface of a planet, we're not ideally suited to being thrust into space ourselves. We can do it, but we have to create habitats for ourselves. We have to do a lot of things to ensure our health. So I think for that reason alone, machines, robots, whatever you want to call them, are likely to remain an even more integral part of the life of anyone who goes into space than it will ever be on the Earth. And we're already seeing that through robotic exploration of the solar system. That has been the default way to explore the solar system. Yes, we've sent some people to the moon and we've had people in orbit around the Earth, but everything else would be so challenging at the moment to send people to do that we've ended up becoming really good at building sophisticated robotic devices to do this. And I do think it's worth, again, in this big picture, stepping back from that and saying, wow, we've actually begun to populate our solar system, not with us, but with machines. And Mars is a great example of this. At the moment, the number changes time to time, but at the moment there's about 9 active robotic missions at Mars. Some on the surface of the planet, others orbiting the planet. And if you were an alien coming to the solar system, right, you show up and you do a survey, you say, okay, what have we got here? You're going to look at look at the third planet out and you say, yeah, that's full of this horrible, messy biology. Oh, but the fourth planet, that's nice. That's got this clean machine life. And, something interesting is happening there. And Mars is arguably, whether or not life has and still exists, biological life has existed on Mars or still exists on Mars, it is absolutely incontrovertible that today Mars is a machine run planet. It is inhabited by machines. Now, yes, they are still tethered to biology back on the Earth. They're not fully autonomous, although they are, we're making machines, spacecraft that are more and more autonomous, because that is as an important quality in spacecraft. But yeah, it's very interesting looking at things that way. And then it's not just Mars. We've got probes heading out into interstellar space in the Voyager spacecraft. Those are robots. They're machines, they're technology, they're not us, but they are us as well. So I think also, if you project further down the line, as I do in the book, thinking about the nature of life dispersing into the solar system, it's going to be hand in hand with technology. It's going to be hand in hand with machines, robots, probably AI of some form or machine learning. And, through that perspective, that is already what's happening. We're already sprinkling the solar system with the sort of what will become the ancestors of future machine life in the solar system. And I think if people ever take up residence on Mars for any extended period of time, it will be through the augmentation of machines. It will be through the autonomy of machines. Life for those people will be very different in some ways than for us, but they'll still be ordering things to eat. They'll still be needing things repaired, and much of that will be taking place through machines. Whether it's drones delivering your food on Mars, or your or coming to fix your electrical systems or your plumbing or whatever. The future, not just on Earth but out there in the universe, is a much more there's much more intimate connection between biology and machinery, I think.
I think there's something that shifted in public discourse, because there's an idea that until we are at a separate location, it hasn't functioned in a full way. But it's sort of like, I was thinking of, let's say, the TCP/IP internet packets right now. I'm not physically following the electrical current all the way, and or the optic link, optic connection across the whole path all the way to you and then back, to say that, oh, we made it there. We don't count that as a requirement. So maybe we are more set up for certain places here. We might set up certain places there, but to have an extension out there is not that different from having power lines and all these telecommunications devices doing things. And nobody says, oh, I have to travel with it like a drone across the whole land for it to be a part of what we do. So if that perspective shifted, then things like robots, like you're mentioning, on there traveling would count like we are already making our way there. I think it would be a good societal shift in some regard. Separate from the robots, what about when there are microbes and earth material that probes send out there? Have we already started spreading Earth's biosphere?
Yes, this is something that in my scientific field of astrobiology we're very aware of, we're acutely aware of, because just as much as we want to find other life, indigenous life that might exist on Mars or elsewhere in the solar system, perhaps on the icy moons around some of the giant planets, we have to be careful to not fool ourselves by sort of redetecting life that actually originated on the Earth. And so this has been debated for a long time, actually since almost the beginning of the space age in the late 1950s. People immediately started to understand that earthly spacecraft will almost certainly carry microbes with them. And then, of course, there's the possibility of stuff being brought back to Earth that you may or may not want to bring back to Earth. So in the early days, at the same time, in the 50s and 1960s and into the 1970s, our appreciation of the diversity and tenacity of microbial life was, not as great as it is now. We now understand that microbial life, meaning bacteria, single-celled organisms, bacteria or archaea, can be extremely resilient and quite hard to detect through sort of conventional, old-school methods like petri dishes and so on. Most life isn't easily cultured in a lab. Most of life on the planet is not easily cultured. You have to look for it in other ways. So so the interesting thing is, back in the heyday of the 1960s, stuff was being sent to the moon that was actually deliberately coated in bacteria, or if not deliberately, people hadn't really bothered to try to sterilize spacecraft that adequately. So we know for sure there's also there are bags of human refuse on the moon left over from the Apollo era. They didn't bring all their sewage back with them. It's sealed in bags and left on the surface of the moon. So there's absolutely been terrestrial microbial life left there. Probes that are sent to places like Mars, much more attention has been paid to trying to sterilize those probes, largely because of the scientific needs. So if you're looking for life on Mars, you don't want to confuse your search by having too much terrestrial life contaminating things. You want to see if a pristine environment. But at the same time, you don't want to damage an ecosystem, if it exists on Mars, by inserting alien microbes from the Earth. So there's been quite a lot of effort put into sterilizing spacecraft. It has been problematic because our understanding of what sterilization really means, even here on Earth, has evolved. The old-fashioned way of sterilizing things, you put bleach on stuff or you heat stuff up, works for many organisms, but there are extremophile organisms for which that's actually not a problem. And in fact, I think it wasn't that long ago, maybe a decade ago, in the clean rooms of the world where spacecraft finish their assembly, these giant spaces that are kept extremely clean, sterile, and so on, so as not to contaminate the spacecraft for a variety of reasons, some scientific, and then just you don't want dirt on your spacecraft before you put it into space. It was discovered that there are actually certain strains of microbe that really love living in that environment because you've got rid of all their competition. And so there are actually certain, extremophilic organisms that were found in considerable numbers living perfectly happily in the clean rooms because you'd eliminated all their competition and they could handle whatever caustic chemicals were being used. So it's a tricky business, and it becomes even trickier when you have humans involved. Humans are filthy. We can't help it. It's what we are. And so there's considerable amount of thought going into ways to mitigate our sort of unwitting contamination of the solar system. There may be circumstances where we just have to accept that there's going to be some contamination from the Earth, and then we need to understand what that looks like and what the consequences of that are. But it's there's a whole subfield that studies this, and sometimes it's called planetary protection, and it goes both ways. It's about contaminating the universe around us, but it's also about potentially bringing things back that might be problematic for us here on the Earth. It's very interesting.
I think a long time ago, one of my earlier talks was with, I hope I'm remembering correctly, but Charles Cockle. He was studying extremophiles, and it was so interesting when I was finding out about they can live in this super heat or super acidic environment, or almost not alive in some ways, and or makes you question what is living and what is not. And so, if anything is going to make it through these kinds of transport, it's going to be these super individuals of sorts as compared with us, because we look so weak in some regards compared to them in handling anything beyond. We need an air conditioned, something nice and comfortable. So
and
in
at the
some ways
same
they could laugh at us, funny enough, even though they can't laugh.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, at the same time, the discovery of these very resilient organisms that are potentially problematic for space exploration because they contaminate things, that those very same discoveries have bolstered our confidence or enthusiasm for the idea that there could be life today on Mars, because these extreme organisms on Earth show us that there are mechanisms by which life can occupy some very difficult environments, some very tough niches. And that has actually, increased our hopes that somewhere on Mars, even if it's in the past, there were organisms that could definitely handle some of these quite difficult conditions on a planet like Mars. So it's an interesting story that it's problematic in some ways, but it's also actually really wonderful to know that life can absolutely occupy some very alien conditions, because it increases the chances of us finding alien life out there.
It relates with this concept I've always had, where organisms or anything fits where it fits. So if we go there and we don't do well and it's such a struggle and there's so much friction, then that says something. Whereas maybe a bacteria is there and would be there, and we'd say, oh, we need to clear it out, but actually we have no chance out competing that where it is, and that'll be its area. Even on Earth, we have places where people are more situated, less situated, other organisms manage that area, and to switch them would be a huge inefficiency and friction on both ends, and we all accept that. We're gonna, in the ocean, you handle that. We don't have people going into the high pressure parts of the ocean casually today. There's a concept there. Yeah, it's an interesting one. As we go to other land, do we look at ethics, which I've noticed we still always progress as people? So there's ethics, and then there's, you have to think about moving forward in some regard. But people would ask, should Mars be preserved versus inhabited? Do we set up things on it? Will we regret that later? Thoughts on that matter?
Yeah, these are really important and interesting questions, and I would not say that I'm a particularly expert person in terms of answering them, but I do think, well, I try to, and something I do in the book, that I try to look for the positive in space exploration, because it is true that we could look at the idea of settling humans on Mars at some level and ask, could a better society be built? And we've been down this path many times as a species, and we think, yeah, we can design and engineer a better society. We have rules and we have principles, and time again, it doesn't quite work as planned. And I think part of the reason for that is just what we are as humans. We are a distribution of qualities. We are not a monoculture, either as individuals or as groups of people. And that's sort of dispiriting in a way. But I think it's more realistic to see us in that form. And I think about, as a scientist, I think about distributions, statistical distributions. If we were all the same and we all thought the same way and behaved the same way, right, we'd all be absolutely identical. Then maybe, yes, you could set up, ethical societies and have cultures that do all the right things. But inevitably, we're not that single, unified mindset with distribution. There's always outliers. There's always those who, for whatever reason, are going to rock the boat, and sometimes that's good, and often that's not so good. So for Mars, I think, we're going to face many of the same issues that we face on the Earth. But again, thinking big picture, the really broad perspective, and this is something I try to get to in the book, because I try to find an optimistic, outcome for all of this. And I think when you begin to ask about the real scale of our solar system, the real size of things, the separation of worlds, the amount of resources that are out there in the solar system, all of which completely dwarf anything on Earth, completely dwarf anything that life on Earth has yet been exposed to in the last 4 billion years. I think there's a potential there, and this, it's not going to happen in the next decade. It may not happen in the next few centuries. It could be thousands of years down the line. But there's a potential there to sort of dilute us or our descendants in such a way that it profoundly changes the nature of life in this one planetary system. And it changes away from this very sort of walled in life that exists on the Earth. I mean, the Earth is a big planet, but as we know, I think today in modern human life, more than at any point in the past, it can feel very finite. It feels like we're pushing up against the walls. We're running out of options. How do we get around this? And life doesn't care. Life is this big cosmic experiment, and expanding out into the solar system, which is so vast and so full of resources on a scale untapped by life on Earth for 4 billion years, may have profound implications in terms of diluting us as a species. So putting examples of us in many, many different physically separated locations around the solar system. I think a consequence of that is something that we know happens to life because we see it in examples on the Earth, which is you begin to see speciation. So you see divergence of traits between those otherwise related groups of organisms. They become different things over time. So humans, the best answer for humans in the future might be that we allow ourselves to become even more diverse. We speciate and diversify and become groups of different things down the line. And maybe that is the best solution to all our quandaries over ethics and how do we set up equitable societies and so on. Is to some extent we have to let go. But if we can let go in a way that allows for the possibility of options down the line, that may be the best possible future for us. Sorry, that sounds like I'm really preachy, but I think it's worth considering that our problems on Earth, come down to the fact that we live on a finite world. If we can change that piece of the equation, maybe that's something new enough that it will improve life for everyone.
Of sorts, but ethic does describe that way. I once had Susan Liaotao on the show. She's at Stanford, and her books are somewhere back there, but she writes about ethics. And so she looks just into that category. And even though it's not exactly my default category to look into, a little bit of it can be good, so that I get the feeling like 10-15% of that added on to a project gives you a little insight, even if it doesn't alter the path. And you're like, okay, this might be something we look back at later that's pretty efficient in some way, or helped us to avoid some scenario. So it's cool to think about. It's a bigger picture type of item. We are in Darwinian evolution, where when we're on Earth, once we leave Earth, are we doing technological evolution instead of Darwinian evolution?
See, I would say that they're the same thing. actually. I think. I think, you know, for me, there is very little separation between, you know, biological evolution or any kind of selectively induced evolution in a system and technological evolution. I think you can isolate or try to isolate the history of technology and ask whether it's changing sort of in the similar way to a Darwinian system, and I think the answer is largely yes. It's not quite as clean as that because it's still connected to biology. You know, we're enmeshed. You know, technology and us and other species that deploy sort of tools and build structures and so on. They're sort of, you know, intimately connected. So it's not isolated in the way that you could look at the evolution of a single microbe starting a few billion years ago. Although even that is not necessarily isolated from the world around it, right? Microbes, like all life, modifies the environment out of which it came. And it's this sort of endless cycle of modification and change and modification and change and so on. So for me, and this is just speaking personally, I feel quite strongly that, you know, we should be looking at technology through a Darwinian lens, with some small modifications because it's a more complex system because biological life forms part of the environment into which technology evolves or from which technology evolves. So yeah, and therefore, you know, the move from a planet out into interplanetary existence, that may be part of what propels technology to some new level of complexity that is not attainable on the Earth. Because it's part of if technology is also being evolved by its environment, change that environment, and you will change the selective pressures yet again. And the selective pressures of interplanetary existence are different than the selective pressures of existence on a single planet. So I don't know if that really gets to your point, but that's my personal feeling about it. There's much less difference between technology and biology than we might want to think.
I once talked with Jana Gallus at UCLA in the MBA program, and she wrote about alignments and rewards for people. And so we follow that. That's our selective pressure or people selective pressure in groupthink. And then when you go further down to biology and then even to physics, then the selective pressures are much more the things we think of as selective pressures, like actual pressure or temperature-based pressure, those kinds of things. And then that guides what happens because there's only so much that can happen once that's already in place. So to not take that into account and then to say, well, this happened, but did it really just we're not giving we always public discussion is more often about this upper layer here versus clearly it was on the way emergent, if you will. And so but this doesn't make for as compelling discussion as the surprise a little bit here. Oh, look at that.
That's true. That's true.
Like a light bulb, which is a pretty good one. We as people, as we leave Earth, do we help Earth by going to space? Or does that mean we failed at managing Earth?
Wow, you put me on the spot. That's so. Yeah, I think you can look at it in a number of ways. I mean, I think it's on the one hand, certainly in conversations I have with people where I talk about with enthusiasm about space exploration, a lot of people's response is, isn't this just avoiding problems on Earth? Isn't this just a distraction? Isn't it, you know, failing? And if we succeed in, you know, having a settlement on Mars, have we failed the Earth in some way? And I think, you know, there's absolutely a danger of that. At the same time, you know, I think space exploration does offer a way to change the equation. And it's about a number of things. It's, to some extent, it might be about offloading some of the requirements of our Earth-based civilization into space. You know, I hesitate to get too enthusiastic about it, but the current discussion that's happening really literally in the last few weeks about putting computing facilities into space as a way to avoid some of the challenges on the Earth of, you know, building these enormous server farms that require water and energy and so on. You know, there is something to that is not bad necessarily, because there's abundant solar power in space. You can put these data centers up there, they can dissipate their heat out into the cosmos with far less impact in principle on the Earth. Now, of course, you have to build those things, and if you build them on the Earth, you're using raw materials and undoubtedly causing some sort of environmental impact. So, you know, it's not quite there yet. Ideally, you would fabricate them entirely in space. You know, you'd go and mine an asteroid and turn it into microprocessors and spacecraft and build your computing facilities out there. So there are signs that some of the burden on the terrestrial system might be alleviated with doing more things in space. But I actually think a lot of what we might gain for the Earth in a selfish way is stuff that we're already gaining, which is a far deeper insight to the functioning of planetary systems. You know, Mars, for example, is very, very different than the Earth. But by studying it scientifically, by mapping it, by charting it, by monitoring it, by really decoding how that planet behaves, we do learn things about the fundamentals of a planetary environment, about the sort of interaction between geophysical activity and a planetary environment, the nature of atmospheres and how those evolve over time, the nature of climate. We actually, by looking at worlds like Mars or Venus or other places, we're learning about physical extremes that don't exist on the Earth, but learning about those physical extremes can sometimes point to missing pieces in our models of a world like the Earth. You know, they point to missing ways in which we parameterize certain physics of atmospheres, certain physics of photochemistry that takes place in atmospheres and so on. So there is a potential to learn things that could help us be, you know, better occupants of the Earth, I think. But it is, yeah, it's a tricky one. It's a tricky balance. I think big picture, again, going back to this very grand vision of this idea of us dispersing out into the cosmos, you know, a consequence of that could be to greatly alleviate the Earth from the burden of us. You know, could change the equation. And, you know, it can sound a little trite, but in responding to people on this, I sometimes say, well, part of space exploration that I think is sometimes misunderstood is that it's about creating new chances for us. I mean, maybe it won't succeed at doing that, but we won't know until we try. And those new chances might be an opportunity for us to do a bit better than we've done in the past.
Two important points to think of what you're saying there. And I have a closing question of sorts, but one of them is about extremes you brought up. I've noticed that so much information is in the extremes. We don't find as much in the middle usually, unless we're looking at an average of a population in some way. But the extremes of organisms and us always tells us something maybe 10 times more than what would be close to the middle. And so we always look at something that can handle the most heat or the most cold or the most oxygen or the highest VO2 max person. A lot of information is always at those key edges. So I like that you brought that up. And then even when you try things, people who try things like failure or full success in some form, it's way more informative than just comfortably going for many, many years. There's something in that. And then the other thing that came to mind, my channel used to be called Entropy. I combined my name and entropy. And then one material I was writing and most likely will return to, it has momentum in the name of the writing. So I noticed when you were saying momentum earlier, some of these key terms, they've been themed through my existence. And maybe the people who are most inclined in these categories already were thinking about these things from early on. And it was part of their default mindset or way of seeing the world. So it probably is fit kind of like we fit in on Earth in some way. That's two concepts I wanted to bring up. And then here's the question for you in closing. When historians look back 1,000,000 years from now, will the first rockets matter more than agriculture?
Well, let me think. I think they might be on an equal footing, in fact, because I think, agriculture, as that emerged as a way for us to exist, it changed the fundamental dynamic of human existence, right? It shifted, what we spent our time doing, and it perhaps gave us more opportunities to spend time thinking than not. And I think rocketry and space exploration has a similar impact. Earlier I said that you can't do space exploration without thought, without the capacity to to think abstractly. But I think space exploration is not a one-way street. It also changes and has changed our behavior in ways that perhaps have some parallels to agriculture. Our capacity to monitor the planet, to see what's going on every corner of the world, to scan it, to look for actually where our agriculture is. I mean, we use satellite imagery constantly to monitor the health of crops, the spread of human structures, land use, changes in environment, and so on. And that modifies our behavior. So I think agriculture modified human behavior, and I think space exploration actually turns around and feeds back and modifies our behavior in a multitude of ways, whether it's satellite imagery, whether it's communication, navigation, our perspective on the world, right? It all changes our behavior. So I would hedge my bets and say that those historians in 1,000,000 years looking back might place it on an equal footing as agriculture. Space exploration and agriculture are two sort of momentous steps in the history of human life.
I love this discussion. I want to bring to mind a giant leap. If you had a takeaway message for people from a giant leap to know of or to think about on a regular basis, what might that be?
Well, I think it is that don't think about space exploration as just a thing that happens. Think about it as a fundamental change in the nature of the evolution of life on Earth.
Wonderful message that ties it together. Dr. Caleb Sharp, I would like to thank you for having joined on this discussion, A Giant Leap, Mankind Out into Space, and the discussion into that. Thank you for joining on this one and bringing your knowledge back to the program.
My pleasure. Really nice to talk to you.
Same from here, and we are out.